Thank you for that. Is Charlotte there?
I am indeed.
Ah, lovely. I'm not sure you got my email, but I've flagged a couple of pages I'd like to run through in the next session. And the first one is table 3.2 of CIL 10. Would you be able to get that on the screen?
Yep. Oh, 1 second. So CIL 10.
Yeah, and it's page 13. There's a table at the top.
Here we go.
That's it. Yeah.
This one here. Right.
That's it.
Great.
Lovely. That's great. Okay. Well, if I address my comments to Mr. Golland, and this morning we had quite a long session going through the various assumptions you've employed in the modelling, and I now want to look at what's actually happened when you turn the handle on the modelling machine and what's popped out the other end. And there are three sets of results for us to look at. The first will be the high-level testing. And Charlotte, can you just move down to the next page? Table 3.2. That's the one. So, Mr. Golland, these are the results of your high-level testing, and would you like to just talk us through these? What are they telling us? What am I meant to be thinking when I see these?
Right. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes.
Great. Okay. So these represent obviously two notional 1 hectare sites built in built in the nine submarket areas that we talked about before lunch. That's 30 dwellings per hectare, built in 40 dwellings per hectare, and built in the nine slightly larger submarket in the areas that we talked about before lunch, with DPH slightly probably more smaller houses in the 40 DPH, as you'd expect to get them on the site. The figures are residual values, so they are the difference between costs and gross development value, taking into account affordable housing at 35%, taking into account, that's one, affordable housing, as it says in paragraph 313, taking into account affordable housing at 35%, site infrastructure allowance at 1,500 per unit, as well as a allowance of 10,000 per unit across the 10 years, take account of sustainability and accessibility policies that we discussed before lunch. So it's giving us residual values for that notional 1 hectare site, and clearly you can see Wentworth as a one-off, but if we took Virginia Water, for example, we would expect there to be a residual value of 6.87 million if it was a 30 dwelling per hectare scheme. And in Addleston, for example, we would expect the residual value to be 2.63. The reason for that variance is 99% down to differences in house prices, which vary, but we're assuming that build costs, for the purposes of this exercise, don't vary so much. Clearly, they'll vary between developers, and you may build a higher product in Virginia Water than you build in Addleston, but all other things equal, that's what those figures are suggesting. And then, obviously, for the 40 dwellings per hectare, you're getting the same spread of value. So as you were saying earlier, so the sensitivity of the residual value is very much in relation to where the development is taking place. These are residual values and not land values. One might have.
Let me just make sure I understand what I'm seeing here. So if we just focus on the 30 dwelling per hectare column, and I pick a one in the middle. Let's just go for Chertsey, and that is giving a value of 3.58 million per hectare. Now, what you're saying then is, having taken into account all of the scheme costs, affordable housing, policy compliant levels, and all of your factoring in of buffers that you talked about, developer profit at 20%, 6% on affordable housing, you factor all of that in, and out of the other end comes a residual value of 3.58. Now, am I right in thinking that of that 3.58 million, you would then have to deduct the land costs, the land value from that, and then what you've got left over could, in theory at least, support a CIL. Is that correct?
You wouldn't, in terms of what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve a CIL that doesn't put off developers and doesn't put off landowners bringing the site forward. So as you correctly said,
I was talking about the potential to support a CIL.
Indeed. So the potential to support a CIL is somewhere between on a greenfield site, somewhere between £20,000 per hectare and in Chertsey 3.6 million, 3.58 million. That's the potential to support a CIL.
Sorry, you were saying it's the difference between. Say that again.
The potential to support a CIL is between a 1 hectare site that is valued for our farmland at 20,000 and a planning permission with 35% affordable housing, 20% developer profit, and the other impacts, the 10,000 and the 1,500. And so the potential to support a CIL is, I'm just doing the maths on this, 3.5 million less the 20,000. So it's actually 3.5 million in effect. So divided by 30. So it's the potential to support a CIL is 119,000 a dwelling.
Oh yeah, but that's supplying a farm and an agricultural value, isn't it?
But that is the potential. So somebody in the market is going to say, of that uplift, how much am I prepared to pay in CIL? If that person's prepared to pay 100% of the uplift, which they're not, and I appreciate, if they were doing, then they would be looking to pay £120,000 per unit in CIL.
Gotcha. Okay. Hang on a second.
Yeah, maybe, sir, if we looked at the there's another table towards the end, which is on page 71.
Yes, I was going to go there next. Yes.
Table 6.3, which basically regurgitates the same residual values in that left-hand column.
Charlotte, could you go to page 71 of the same document, please? Yeah. Yep.
So that's regurgitating the same figures in their left-hand column: 35% affordable housing, 20% profit, taking into account 10,000 for accessibility and the rest of the standards that we factored in, and taking into account £1,500 of Section 106. We then bring back into play our suggested hope value for commercial land, which is the £2,000 per hectare, and the surplus then that we're talking about is then, in the case of Wentworth, 14.1 million, 14.18, and in the case of Staines, 500,000 at the bottom. We then work that back into the dwellings, so the 14.1 divided by 30 gives us 473,000, at the bottom end virtually 17,000. and then the column on the right hand side breaks it down from the dwellings into the surplus for dwelling into the surplus on a square metre basis, assuming a dwelling of 80 square metres.
Right, I've got you. Now, I've got a question here which is going to come up with the other test results as well. And I'm glad you've taken this to this table, because this is a table in the your final report. Now, there is a similar table that appears in CIL 08, which is called the Technical Background Document. And that is table 5.1, and I'm a bit confused by it, because there are, if we could, before Charlotte goes there, if we could just look at the range of figures in the right-hand column of table 6.3, we'll see there 5,908 at the top and 2,008 at the bottom in the stains area. Now, I'm picking up different figures in, so if I could ask Charlotte to go to table 5.1 of CIL 8, which is on page 22. There it is, yeah. Yeah, if we go to the column which is second from the right, which I think is meant to be the same set of figures we were just looking at, they're different. They're not far out, but in your original report, if we take the Wentworth figure, that was 5,908 in your original report, and here it's 5,108. And at the other end of the table, your stains figure was 208, and it's now showing as 180. Have I missed something, or am I comparing like with like, or have I got confused?
It looks as though there's a. I may invite John to butt in, but it looks like the floor areas assumed might be different. So I'll have assumed a floor area of. I've assumed 30 units at 80. So I've assumed a floor area at 2,400. I think he's assumed a floor area coverage for the 1 hectare site at 2,776. So his is a bigger floor area, which means that which means that his figures on page 20 on the penultimate column from the right are lower. So we're dividing the same in the column 1, 2, 3, 4 from the left, where it says difference. We're dividing that column by different areas, because I'm assuming 30 dwellings per hectare at 80 square meters, which comes to 2,400 square meters coverage. He's assuming a bigger coverage, so the residual then gets divided by a bigger number, which then gets you to a lower surplus per square meter. I think that's what it is. Okay, well, you can imagine I've got to ask, well, you both represent the council. I need to know which is right, which is the figure I should rely on. Is it the original report, or is it this technical background document, which bears the same date? It's December 2019. I believe it's the figures that are in the December 2000 in the technical background document, because not least because they're lower, they're more cautious figures. So he's saying, I think, that in practice you would get a more coverage from the site than I've actually assumed. Maybe my units are probably a bit on the small side, but this is giving you a more conservative estimate of what's actually deliverable in terms of viability, and that's a safer position from our CIL.
I think Mr. Devonshire might be about to help us out. Mr. Devonshire?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to clarify, obviously what Andrew's done is he's looked at those costs, and then as he said, he's basically done 30 units at 80 square meters per unit. But what we've done to basically get to his 2,400 square meters for a site, but what we've done is we've applied the housing mix as required by policy SL19 in a local plan, and that gets you to a square meterage of 2776.
Is that on the same density, same 30?
Yes. Yeah. So it's 30 units. Only our assumption of the 30 units.
You're just assuming more coverage. Yeah.
Well, we're assuming that it meets policy compliance, which is the mix of units set out in policy SL19.
Okay, that's clear. I won't have to ask the question for the other modelling. So, okay. Well, let's stick with this table then. So what that's telling me then is, using what you're saying are the most relevant assumptions, that second from the right column there, where it says pound per square metre, that is the notwithstanding everything about all the buffers that you've stated, that those figures in there are the theoretical levels of CIL that could be sustained. Is that correct?
I believe so. Yes.
Yes, that's correct. Basically, the first column, it says pounds per square metre, which is obviously the penultimate column, is the theoretical maximum for CIL. Okay,
so we're seeing values there from in the lower value areas, £180 in the Staines border north, right up to staggering over 5,000 in Wentworth, which is obviously something of an anomaly. But middle ground, 472, 569, 800s. Overall, I mean, what that's telling me, experience of looking at these sort of appraisals in other places, that generally development is viable, and in some places very much so.
I think it's showing it's viable, and it's showing it's the ability of the sites to contribute towards all the physical, social and environmental infrastructure that goes with it. They need to make it work.
Okay, I've got Mr. Tenconi indicating. Mr. Tenconi?
Yes, sir. I just wanted to point out that I'm not clear if the term Wentworth is defined as distinct from Virginia Water. It may be that it means the Wentworth estate, but it's not clear. But in any event, broadly speaking, that number at the top is completely meaningless and useless, because the Wentworth Estates Act provides covenants against site splitting. So in practice, you will never ever achieve at best more than 2 houses per hectare. And if the existing house has a more than 1 hectare land site associated with it, it cannot be split, nor will splits be tolerated.
Understood. Okay, I've got Mr. Jackson next.
Yes, thank you, sir. It was just a query regarding unit size, unit floor space. It seems that we're now moving from dwellings averaging 80 square metres to where they are now 92 square metres. That, to my mind, unless I'm missing something, that to my mind in the calculations has an impact on build cost. You're adding an additional 12 square metres per dwelling. It's a site that's a 1 hectare site that you're assuming is going to deliver 30 dwellings. So there is a difference there that either I've missed it or it's been missed from the calculation in terms of build cost, which has an impact on residual land value calculations, I'm assuming.
Well, that's a good point to put back to Mr. Golland, in the sense that consistency is important in this modelling. I accept what Mr. Devonshire said about the more up-to-date mix better reflecting policy, but if that is the case, the 2776 square metres per hectare, then Mr. Jackson is right, isn't he? That means you've got an average unit size of 92.5 square metres, and the question that falls out of that is, has that been reflected in your modelling?
Well, sir, it's I've taken a range of different sizes in my analysis, and my analysis then looks at the relationship between costs and values. If your average size of units was for a development was 92 rather than 80, sure, costs would be more, but values would also be more. So you're actually adding an extra 12 meters of value into the viability. So if I was to rerun my numbers, you wouldn't have the numbers which are in the difference column. You would have the numbers in the difference column times 92 divided by 80. So the residuals would increase because there are positive residuals in this part of the world. The residuals would increase, and therefore you would actually have a much higher surplus at the end of the day. The reason why there's a difference here is because we initially took 80 square meters, which is on a smaller unit size. Here we're taking 92 for the sake of covering the site better. But if we were to do that, if we were to run everything with an average size of 92, it would make it more viable. The scheme would be more viable than less so. And there is a side issue to this, in that if you've got more smaller, you could argue if you've got more smaller units, the values per square meter would be higher. So if you've got more terraces and flats, so more terraces and semis, for example, rather than detached houses, your selling prices per square meter would be higher. But you'd have to investigate that on the basis of looking at a scheme of 80 versus a scheme of average 92. But I don't think it's material, because I think all you end up saying is, if your scheme has an average coverage of dwellings with an average of 92 square meters, you just make the overall viability more viable than you would do if you had dwellings at 80 square meters.
Okay, I think Mr. Jackson wants to come back in.
If I can, sir, and it's the point that Mr. Golland really went to at the end, where, in my experience, certainly in dealing with viability work, the smaller units always tend to command higher sales per square foot or square meter values, whereas larger units tend to be sort of priced slightly lower per unit of floor space. And I don't think that the explanation that's been given really, I think it was slightly misleading at the beginning, the suggestion that there would definitely be more sales values there versus build cost. I don't think it's a straight line situation. I think there is difference, and I think that this, I mean, it seems to me it's something that seemed rather fundamental and probably should be explored in a bit more detail.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's not a straight line. It's not a straight line relationship. I agree totally. But I don't think it's, when you're looking at these surpluses, which are so substantial as they are, I don't think that that difference is material or is substantial.
Okay, I think Mr. Smith wants to come in.
Really, just to reiterate and agree with Mr. Jackson's points, really, in respect of the values decreasing with the size of the units and the evidence base that's been provided doesn't reflect the local authorities' policies, and it's difficult to find that the results are going to be appropriate, and we can't just assume that viability will increase with larger unit sizes.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you have to accept that the viability changes with the mix. All this table is showing 5.1 is that if you had and in practice when schemes come forward, it will change. All this table is showing in table 5.1 is that these are the particular surpluses. If you would have this type of development, we're not kind of committing every developer to develop at an average units at 92 pounds per square metre. The viability will come out in the wash on a scheme by scheme basis, but I think there's a mountain being made over a molehill on this one, quite frankly.
But shouldn't the viability testing reflect the local plan policies?
We tested it. We tested at 80. The size of the unit, you can, as we have done here, you can look at different coverages. It's only at the end of the day, it's only a sensitivity test that's been done here.
Can I just?
Mr. Dempsey,
Yeah. My understanding is that in the testing of the 1 hectare sites, which are basically what we're looking at here, that Andrew has tested a policy compliant mix on a 1 hectare site.
Correct. That's right.
Correct. Which is basically gets you to the 2776. So basically, we have tested 2776 square meters because we have tested a policy compliant mix on a 1 hectare site.
Correct. So all I'm doing in table 6.3 of my CIL 10 is saying what if the units were average size 80? These would be the results. I could equally have said what happens if the unit size average is 100 or is 50 or is 70 or whatever. It would just kick out a different result. For the table which has been used for policy for CIL setting purposes, is looking at a coverage to 2776, and these are therefore the surfaces which are there.
Okay. Still got a hand up from Mr. Smith. Do you want to come back?
Sorry, no.
No. Okay. Well, no. I think. Well, let's move on, because I think we'll have some similar themes as we look through the other results. So, probably easiest if we stay with the same document. And Charlotte, could you just go down a couple of pages to page 24? I think it's table 5.3. That's the one. Okay. Well, so we're moving on now from those notional 1 hectare sites to look at some of the local plan allocation sites, and well, I'm going to just hand over to Mr. Golland to just explain what I'm seeing in this table.
So in table 5.3, sir.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So you're seeing the On the left, you can see obviously the site. You're seeing the sites, and going rightwards, you're seeing the site size in hectares. You're seeing then the residual value, which replicates what I've got in my report at table 6.4, page 72. You've then got a benchmark land value, and that is adjusted that is adjusted on the basis of £2 million a hectare. £2 million a hectare for a site of 0.3 gets us to 600,000. I'm looking across Addleston West now. The surplus, therefore, is the difference between columns 3 and 4. That's the difference.
Yeah.
These are the estimated gross prices, gross coverage per square metre, and then in the penultimate column from the right-hand side is the ultimate surplus, and then we've identified the buffer at 50% of that.
Okay, right. Let's just get rid of one anomaly, put it to one side. So Chertsey Bitten C, which is a site, as I recall, it's an allocation for a very small number of houses. I think it might have been 9, plus some traveller pitches. What's going on with that one then, with its red result?
It's kicking out a very low, because of the low density. You're looking at a low residual from a low number of houses versus an assumed high value. So what you're doing there, assuming that someone's going to go on. Sorry. You're assuming there's a demand in that site for someone to pay £2 million for the site, then actually all it's worth with the current planning is 128,000. So it doesn't overcome the land value benchmark hurdle.
Okay, so that, I mean, jumping ahead a little bit, but that is the council's proposed zone F, which is 0 rated. Is that correct?
I believe so.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, let's then look at the others, and if we look at the 2 right-hand columns, so second in from the right, again, these are I suppose the maximum theoretical CIL amounts using your modelling. And then am I reading the right-hand column, the very right-hand column, and saying, well, okay, well, those are the maximum amounts. We're going to apply a buffer of 50%, and these are the figures that pop out. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Obviously, if that buffer changed percentage, the figures would be different. But yes, in principle, that's right. Yes.
Okay. Now, I struggled a little bit when I was doing my prep on this. I was trying to work out, and maybe it's somewhere buried in the documentation, but I was trying to work out which of these sites is in which proposed charging zone. Is it set out clearly? I think I've worked them out, but is it said anywhere?
I might defer to John on that. I mean, there's no perfect science to doing this, but obviously it needs to be robust in terms of the CIL test.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in that table, it doesn't identify which zones those sites are in, because at that point in that particular background document, we actually hadn't got onto the point of distinguishing different charging zones based on the surpluses and viability evidence at the point that you get to that table. It's not till later on that you start looking at the results of that table and all the other tables that you suddenly then start to look at where zoning might different charging zones might be set. Good
point. Yeah, I'm jumping ahead a little bit in my eagerness. Let's come back to it a little bit later. Okay, so that's what we're seeing then from the allocation sites. Charlotte, could you just scroll the page down, because it goes on to the following page 25. So that's the full set. And because we've got Longdon Garden Village on there, which is included in the modelling, which is coming out at 297. Okay, let's deal with the final set of results, which are on smaller sites, and then we'll take stock of what it all means and talk about zones and charges. So if we could go to, I think same document, it might be page 26. So just next page. And again, Mr. Golland, could you talk us through this?
Yes. Are you looking at 5455? Sorry, but 54. I think is 54 relates to single dwelling. So in essence, the residual land value there is in essence the plot value.
Yeah.
Benchmark will be the plot value based on the 2 million per hectare, with a difference, with a square metre £95 per square metre. Again, that could be larger or smaller. Gives us then the pound per square metre, and then the buffer at 50%. So it follows through in the same way as in essence as the other tables, but obviously on a much smaller scheme. Except obviously that I'm just checking the figures. The residual values that you start off with are not based on 35% affordable. They're based on 0 affordable, because those sites will not attract affordable housing. I think that's square metre.
And effectively, what we're seeing there is that even though these sites haven't got economies of scale, the effect of not making affordable housing contributions it gives them healthier viability results. Is that fair to say?
Massively so, yeah. The affordable housing is really what is the key. I'm sure people around the table or around the offices will agree that the affordable housing is really the key item which makes or breaks the viability, and not the CIL. And we're saying that if there's no CIL on those no affordable housing on those small sites, CIL could be ratcheted up by a significant amount.
Okay. All right. Well, they are the residential results. There is another one which is actually buried in your commercial, which is retirement housing. We don't need to go to the page, but your modelling result is over 2,372, I think. So you're suggesting that that has strong viability.
Yes, not least because you need to be careful with retirement housing, but generally speaking, I know that the costs are higher and it's less efficient, but generally speaking, the selling prices of retirement flat sheltered housing are anywhere between 25 and 50% higher than standard housing. So that makes a big difference to the viability.
Okay. Right. Just looking to see if anybody wants to say anything about those results before we go into a discussion on zones and charges, because effectively those are the outputs of your evidence gathering and processing, and you are saying that these three sets of results then sit behind and justify the charging proposals that are set out in the draft charging schedule as intended to be modified. So talk me through then. I think this is probably a double act with Mr. Golland and Mr. Devonshire. Talk me through the approach to zones and charges and how we've arrived at the modified draft charging schedule.
John, do you want to take the lead on this one? I just know that there's a degree of pragmatism which sits alongside all the numbers with all these things.
Yeah, that's fine. Basically looking, I mean, we looked at the viability results across the free testing. So that was the high level testing, the allocation sites, and the small sites. That was based on the sub-market areas that Andrew had basically set out in his CIL viability report. And they are shown in table 5.6 of CIL 08, which is on page 27, if Charlotte wanted to scroll down.
No, up too far. That's it.
That's it, yeah. So basically we took a view that we looked at those numbers across the board, so that's the 3 different types of testing. And then from that, we looked at whether or not there were any similarities or differences between those rates or potential for CIL that we could pull out, which would then form the basis for CIL charges. So rather than just look at CIL charging areas or zones based on the sub-markets, what we basically looked at was obviously what the PPG on CIL recommends is, on the one hand, optimizing your ability to charge CIL, but also on the other hand, reducing complexity in your charging schedule. So in doing that, we looked at, as you can see, the range of values that we have here, and then we tried to basically piece that down into different charging zones. So for something like, I mean, Wentworth is so sort of off the scale, as it were. I mean, we could have set a separate charging zone for it, but to be quite honest, given the type of development and the context of the area, it wasn't particularly worth it, because to be quite honest, I suspect most development that's going to come forward in the Wentworth area is likely to be replacement dwellings or extensions, either which it could be exempt from CIL anyway. So then we had a look at, if you look at the ranges for Virginia Water, when you're looking at something like £382 to £1,268, what we've tended to do is err on the side of caution and take the lowest sort of common denominator. So especially where that relates to one of our housing allocation sites. So the £382 per square metre that you see against the allocation sites in Virginia Water is actually one of the, I think it's the Virginia Water North site, and obviously we would not want to place any of our allocations at risk. So then looking at that, we then looking at Englefield Green, it's got similar results to Virginia Water, slightly higher in some places and slightly lower in others, but the rates relative to one another are similar enough. And given the fact that Wentworth, Virginia Water and Englefield all sit contiguous with each other, it basically seemed reasonable and appropriate to place that into a single charging zone using the £380 per square metre as the lowest common denominator for that particular zone. Prior to updating the viability work, we had placed Ottershaw in that zone as well, because that's showing a lowest charge of £396, which is the allocation Ottershaw East.
Yep.
but when we came to do the additional CIL viability work based on potential impacts of COVID, where you might see a 5% drop in house sales, 5% increase in build costs, the figures for offshore slightly, started showing different numbers to Wentworth, Virginia Water, Englefield Green, which is why we then modified that particular zone and placed offshore in its own zone later on through the modifications. Again, coming back to an area like Chertsey and Egham, show remarkably similar surpluses for CIL, where you've only got a few, probably a pound's worth of difference between some of these, although the Egham area itself doesn't actually have any of the local plan allocations, but Chertsey has numerous ones. Again, when we did the CIL viability update in the summer, again, Chertsey and Egham areas came out remarkably similar to one another. I mean, that's probably shown in CIL 09 rather than table, I think it's table 5.7 CIL 09 rather than table CIL 5.6 of CIL 08.
Yeah.
Because they are the numbers based on the updated viability that we undertook in the summer to account for potential impact of COVID-19. But nevertheless, it was the similar methodology, which is look for the similarities between values and, can we have different charging zones, but at the same time reduce the level of complexity, so similar values and similar areas can sit in the same zone. Similarly, again, Addleston, you can see is lower in value than Egham Chertsey, and Staines Border itself, which is the area of Egham east of the M25, again shows lower scope and lower values in the main. The Woodham area kind of sits in the middle, however, as there is only a limited amount of development expected to come forward from that area, again, reducing complexity, we did not think it was necessary to have its own charging zone. So the question was, because it sits contiguous with either offshore or Addleston, do we place it in an offshore zone or do we place it in a Addleston zone? I think from the viability work that was done in the summer, it looked like the Woodham was coming out slightly less viable than the offshore area, so in that instance we placed it with Addleston to reduce the complexity of the charging schedule and the number of charging zones that we have.
Okay, so what I'm picking up there is that the housing sub-areas, the housing market sub-areas, feels like they were a starting point, and then is it fair to say there's been a sort of refinement of those in the light of allocations and updated evidence?
Yeah, I mean, the market or the sub-market areas that are shown in the map in Andrew's viability work in CIL 10, that's the starting point in terms of how we look at the locations of development. And then obviously looking across those sub-markets, we have the figures that are generated and fit into table 5.6, where we're looking at all of those sub-market areas, but also across the different types of development that might come forward. And then it's basically, do those sub-markets, should each of those sub-markets be a charging zone in its own right, or are numbers between some of the sub-markets so similar that they should be in the same charging zone, which again obviously then basically means we have less zones than we do sub-market areas, which obviously is then the balance between optimizing CIL receipts and reducing the level of complexity of the CIL charging schedule in zones.
Okay, I've got a couple of people indicating to come in, but I'm going to ask them to be patient because I just want to run through quickly the zones in reverse alphabetical order, just so I've got a feel for where the local plan sites are. So zones F and G, which are the zero rated zones, zone F we mentioned earlier, which was the one with the red, the negative result earlier. And then we've got zone G, which is Longcross Garden Village. Now, I've noted comments earlier about Longcross, but the approach that I'm picking up from the council there is that in zone F, you're saying that the viability evidence says that cannot support a CIL, and so you've put it in its own zone and given it a 0 rating. And then with Longcross, you've taken the view that this is a strategic site where infrastructure matters are to be dealt with through the Section 106 route. Now, I appreciate there are different views on whether that's right, but that's the council position. Am I correct so far?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay. Well, moving up the zones then, Zone E, which is the I'll keep track because of the modified plan. Zone E is effectively the sort of Staines border area, isn't it? And I think all the evidence there was pointing to still positive viability, but lower levels, as you've got on the table 5.6 there. And this is where. So just make sure we get this right. So the CIL charge that's proposed here for residential is £90. Is that correct?
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that with the? Well, looking at the table there, we've got figures for Staines Border and North, £90 for the high level testing. 386 to 469 for the allocation sites, and 156 to 256. Isn't the high level testing suggesting that is there an issue there?
Well, high level testing is suggesting that with a 50% buffer, a 1 hectare brownfield site could support a still rate of £90 per square metre.
Oh, that's the 50% figure, is it?
Yes.
Ah, right, okay.
Yeah, all of those figures in table 5.6 include the 50% buffer.
Okay, right. So just make a note. Okay, right. And in that zone E, are there any key sites, key local plan sites?
Yes, so in zone E you will find the Falkley Road West and Falkley Road North allocation sites. I think they are policy numbers SL 7 and 8. Or it could be 8 and 9. I think it's 7 and 8. Yeah, policies SL 7 and SL 8 in the adopted local plan.
Okay, so they're in zone E. Right. Zone D, where the charge would be £110. Which of the local plan sites are in zone D?
Okay, so in zone D, that covers the Addleston and Woodham Newhall area. As I said, there's no allocations in the Woodham and Newhall area for residential, but in Addleston you have the Addleston West allocation.
And is it parcel B?
Yes, and you have Vet Labs parcel B as well.
Have you got the policy numbers for those?
Yeah, Vet Labs parcel B is SL 11.
Yeah.
And I believe that the Addleston West allocation is IE8. Yes, IE8.
Okay, thanks. Same for Zone C, where the charge is now, it was 185, the modification is to 180, so a slight reduction. Am I right in thinking there's quite a few local plan sites in Zone C? It'd be useful to have the policy numbers.
Sure. So we'll start off with policy number SL2, which is the Broxend Nursery site.
Yep.
SL3, which is Hamworth Lane, although half of that has already been completed, and I think another 158 dwellings of that has actually been is now under construction, and there's only 50 odd units left outstanding on that particular site at Hamworth Lane.
Okay.
SL6, which is the land at Piercroft Road, Chertsey.
Yep.
Policy SL12, which is the, actually that's not the one, it's in Ottershaw. It would be policy SL13, St Peter's Hospital, but that's already got planning permission, so it wouldn't be liable for CIL. And then it's policies SL14 to SL18, which are the Chertsey Bittams A to Chertsey Bittams E sites.
Got you. Okay, so it's quite a lot in Zone C.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Same question for Zone B.
Okay, Zone B is SL12, which is the offshore east site. And that is the one with, so that should be SL2, sorry, SL2 should be in Zone B, which is the Broxend Nursery site.
Okay, so that... Is it just that one?
It's SL2 and SL12. So you have SL2, the Broxend Nursery site, and SL12, which is Ottershaw East.
SL2, is that Thorpley Road? Is that the same one?
Thorpley Road North is SL7 and Thorpley Road West is SL8.
And then they're in Zone E, aren't they?
Yes.
Okay, and Zone A?
Zone A would be site at Blaze House in Englefield Green, which is policy SL5.
And you've got the Virginia Water sites, haven't you?
Yes, and then you've got Virginia Water North allocation, which is policy SL9. And the Virginia Water South allocation, which is policy SL10.
Okay. Right, okay. I've got a couple of people indicating that they'd like to speak. So I'm going to go to Mr. Jackson first.
So hi, apologies, we have moved on quite away from the point I wanted to make, which was around small sites and individual sites. I was rather late in putting my hand up that you had moved on. It doesn't matter if you don't want to go back. It was just
no, that's fine, Mr. Jackson. You go for it.
Again, we were looking at tables 5.4 and 5.5, and it was, from my point of view, it was a point that I raised similar to previously, which was the disconnect between unit sizes, 80 square metres versus 95 square metres. And if you're looking at individual units or small sites, then I'm not sure how the policy mix would apply to that, whether the viability that had been done was on the basis of an 80 square metre residential unit or a 95 square metre unit.
I'm assuming the council is probably going to say something around these are going to be smaller infill sites and probably not same dimensions as the volume producers, but I'll let them answer. Mr. Collins,
I think ultimately, with a single dwelling, it could be anything. I mean, it could be significantly larger than that, couldn't it? But what we're looking at here is a relationship between price and costs, accepting that does vary by size, particularly the value does vary by size. And again, on a small site, the mix on a small site could be flats, or it could be, on a small half-hectare site, it could be, it could be 20, 30 flats, or it could be, it could be five executive houses. So it could vary between the mix. All the point that we're making here is that we're trying to get our head round. If we wanted to increase the CIL on the smaller sites, by how much as a kind of guideline, as a marker, would we do that? That's not what is being suggested, as I understand. The CIL is going to be a standard. Is going to be actually a standard figure for all different types of sites. So this exercise in setting a CIL miles above what the council is already doing is not really significant to the debate we're having.
Okay. Do you want to come back on that, Mr. Jackson?
No real need. Just again, it was a point of clarification and as to how the viability had been carried out vis-a-vis build cost versus sales value.
Yeah, understood. And sorry if I missed your hand at the time. It's there's a lot going on the screen.
No apologies. I'm new to this virtual platform as well, and I shot off down a rabbit hole trying to look at another document on the screen and never quite got back to where we were. So
no problem. Okay, I'm going to go to Mr. Tenkoni next.
Yes, so it was 2 points of clarification, really. The first one is that in table 5.6, one can see a figure of 297 against Long Cross, which is something to do with a CIL rate, because that's what that table is about. But can the council clarify, or do you know, sir, how it is? How has that number been come on? How has it been developed? And is there a comparison available between the total CIL contribution that Long Cross could make and the total Section 106 contribution, which of course I understand may vary because the planning there seems to be varying as we go, including the contribution to the HIFA loan repayment? So that was the first point. The second point was, I wonder if the council has done any sensitivity to increasing CIL charges on the basis that there is a £100 million shortfall or funding gap, and that it is said by the council that there is good sustainability of CIL charges here, which I take to mean as proposed, they will not disincentivise developers. How is there a sensitivity analysis as to how far you can push them up to try and narrow the gap of funding before you get to the point where there is disincentivisation?
Okay, well, we'll ask that of the councillor if who's going to take that.
I think the answer is the answer is it's difficult. It's always difficult to find the tipping point, because the tipping point is always around this difficult issue that we've been debating, which is to do with what's an appropriate what's actually appropriate land value benchmark. I mean, the beauty of the current system is that you can obviously run within an authority. You can run the SIL alongside the section 106, and if the section, if you shoved your SIL up, you could then be much more flexible on a site-by-site basis about what you're asking for in terms of section 106, and in particular that to do with affordable housing. Without diversing too much, the problem that's going to happen with the proposed white paper, which is to stick the SIL all into one pot, we don't get any affordable housing, is that nothing will at all will be flexible. So you could put the SIL up, and you could say, in order to achieve this, we're going to be more flexible about our affordable housing. And people know that, anyway on the side-by-side basis. But I don't think you can. You have to have that flexibility within the process.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure that answers the second question. I don't think it addresses the first question at all.
So, sorry, can you elaborate?
Well, the first question was about the comparison between the SIL output in theory on Longcross if the number for SIL is 297, as against the section 106 charges plus repayment of the HIFA grant from Longcross.
No, I didn't answer it. So I was hoping John would be preparing himself for that particular question. I hope I'd answered in part of the second question. But maybe I didn't do that either.
Just to answer Mr. Tencone's first point, which is about how much SIL would be raised if a rate was set at 297 for Longcross, that would be in the region of around £38 million, as opposed to the 60 million that we're trying to get through section 106. I think the other thing to remember also with Longcross is there were a number of scenarios where there could have been a scenario which is a more pessimistic one, where the ability to charge SIL would have been low or very low, and the planning practice guidance note on SIL states for strategic sites that where it appears that rates are either low or very low for strategic sites, then charging authorities could consider setting zero rates. There's also the aspect that we've said before, which is at the moment the £60 million which would come through section 106, and that number, as I said, I believe was discussed during the local plan examination for the Longcross site, does not include the potential for A320 contributions, which would have to be added to that £60 million. So you're looking at a cost at Longcross of £60 million plus A320, plus to then put a SIL charge on top of that, has the potential to impact viability to a degree where we would not want to start placing that site at risk, given its strategic nature. And I think the other point to make about that is obviously how infrastructure comes forward, because with the community infrastructure levy, the way it works in most instances, unless the council are minded to make it available, SIL would come forward simply as a cash payment. It would not deliver the infrastructure on site. I know that sometimes there are, you can have in-kind payments, which tends to be a land payment, not the actual delivery of the infrastructure. And if a SIL payment was to come forward on the Longcross site, and whilst I'm sure the council would spend that money on the delivery of infrastructure on the Longcross site, CIL breaks the link between the contribution raised and where infrastructure is delivered. So there's no guarantee that any monies raised through CIL from Longcross will be spent at Longcross or even in the immediate vicinity of the area. Whereas with Section 106, because it is still tied to the development and any contributions have to be directly related, then we know that the physical delivery of infrastructure on that site will come forward through Section 106 because it can be done that way. Just coming back to the point in terms of sensitivity analysis for rates, I mean, obviously what we've tried to do is apply a buffer to ensure that any rates that come forward do not place development at risk in terms of economic viability. And we've done 50%. I know this is probably later on the agenda, but I mean, we've applied a 50% buffer in a normal housing market because we know that this is our first charging schedule. We also know that CIL viability is always going to be a high-level viability assessment, but also it allows for flexibility in the market should the market change. So in terms of that sensitivity, really that 50% buffer is the sensitivity. If we started putting our rates upwards in our first charging schedule, then obviously we don't know what impact that would have until we actually start getting development through the pipeline. And if development starts coming through the pipeline and it's basically saying we can't afford your CIL rates, then we know we've gone too far. Whereas if we set a 50% buffer to start with now, or a 50% buffer in a normal market, then at least we can see what happens when development starts coming through the pipeline in terms of where we are with our rates and whether they should be adjusted upwards or downwards in the future.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, I think that probably does lead neatly into the last part of the session, which is discussion really around buffers, sensitivity testing, whether it's COVID-19, Brexit, or whatever. And I think Mr. Dench has answered some of the questions I was going to pose there, but I think it would be useful just to have a brief discussion on that in terms of sensitivity testing, buffers, and then I'll invite a few contributions, and so we'll probably take a break at that point before coming on to the student housing after that. So I don't know if Mr. Dempsey or Mr. Golland would like to just talk through that sort of whole issue of buffers and headroom and the crystal ball gazing about what might happen in the future.
Do you want me, Andrew? Do you want me to start on?
Yeah, sure.
I'll start on the buffer, and then maybe you can come in with the crystal ball gazing, as it were. Just in terms of the buffer, as I was saying just a moment ago, we've applied a 50% buffer simply because it's our first draft charging schedule, so we kind of need to know where to set CIL rates with a little bit more flexibility. And also given the, I suppose, the high level nature of viability, which is what it's always going to be when you have like local plan or CIL viability assessments. But what we've done since we updated the viability in the summer to take account of the potential impact of COVID, what we did is we looked at the CIL viability results then, and then we applied a 30% buffer. And the reason for applying a 30% buffer in that particular scenario, which was a house price fall of 5%, house build cost of increase of 5%, we applied 30% simply because if that was a depressed market, then once a market returns to normal, then obviously the buffer would be above 30%. So basically what we're saying is, if you continue to apply a 50% buffer in a depressed market, when that market returns to normal, what you will end up with is more likely to be a 60 or 70% buffer than a 50% buffer. And I think that's a level of buffer that the council would find to be unreasonable, given the level of the infrastructure funding gap that faces them. So I mean that's kind of where we came from in terms of the buffer, in terms of the 50% or the 30% in a COVID market. But I'll hand over to Andrew in terms of potential impacts, or where we are now with the housing market in terms of sales values or build costs, or and I don't know whether or not he wants to Brexit or not, but I'll hand that over to Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, John. We in the representations response paper in June, July. I tried to look at what was going on. Again, this is a moving feast. So I looked at sort of house builder reports. I looked at what planners were saying, and I looked at what certainly some of the major surveying companies were saying about the market. Quite difficult to summarise what's going on, and everything's local. I did look before today's meeting at the prices for Runnymede Borough over the 2020, when they've risen by around 3% according to the Land Registry, against the background of build costs which appear to be stagnant. So, you know, as you crunch the numbers for 2020, we're in a better position now, just on the basis of the numbers, than we were at the beginning of the year. One wonders why that might be, against all the gloom and doom. And it's probably something to do with the fact that there's still a large shortage of housing around the country, and obviously around the southeast in particular. So although the confidence might be down, on the other side, the shortage and the imbalance between the number of households and the number of houses available is always going to have some kind of upward pressure on the prices, and that combined with very low interest rates for those who can get mortgages, will let them into the housing market at a relatively affordable level. So I think the picture is difficult, as John alluded to earlier. Difficult to predict. As John alluded to earlier, we did some number crunching in that July paper, which looks at the impact of prices up, prices down, costs up, costs down, and that's been taken into account in terms of the CIL rates that have been set. And clearly, a local authority doesn't want to be in a situation where it's changing its CIL every time. But to come back to the previous point, there is the real viability hit in each case is affordable housing, and that can always give in a market where things are much more tricky. I think when we did when we looked at the local plan viability testing, looking at affordable housing in particular, we found, for example, that at the top end of the market, 35% affordable housing is really very, very small. You've seen the residuals which are there. The impacts of 35% affordable housing are really very minimal, and I argued at the time that actually at the top end, those targets could be higher. So in the top end of the market, and in the locations towards the middle, where a lot of the development is, those affordable housing targets are relatively kind to developers as things stand. But given the process as it currently is, assuming we don't go to the white paper proposals, affordable housing can give in situations where there's individual circumstances on the site, or the market for some reason suddenly loses confidence.
Okay, thank you for that. Just if anybody wants to make any comments on that, I'll just wait a moment because we've had some delays. No, I can't see any. Oh, yes, Mr. Jackson, couldn't resist. Mr. Jackson, over to you.
Yes, so it's probably the basis of my client A2 Dominion's sort of involvement in this process. There's clearly, and I understand it, the suggestion that affordable housing will be the thing that gives when viability becomes difficult. The issue for my client as a registered provider is that they don't want to be giving on affordable housing. Clearly that's their whole raison d'etre. And in situations where viability is an issue for them, the fact that there is quite a high CIL amount to pay, which the private for sale housing that they will be seeking to deliver will have to bear. There's just this sort of disconnect, shall we say, where they are desperately trying to deliver affordable housing, but have a high CIL bill. The only thing I can see really that is a remedy is some form of discretionary CIL relief. I don't know what the council's position might be on that, and clearly it's something that we would need to explore on a site-specific viability basis, rather than something through this plan examination. But I just raise it as an issue.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Can I make a point, sir?
Of course you can.
I think, yeah. I mean, having said affordable housing will give, I think will give, but it doesn't need to give much in order to deliver pretty near to an affordable housing target. So, you know, if you imagine in this part of the world, if you imagine that there's maybe for an affordable unit, the developer is providing, as they would always argue, a free land plot. So around here, that's probably going to be 100,000. Plus, it's got to meet the shortfall between what the unit is worth to the housing association, what it costs to build. So it's probably costing 150,000 per unit, which is going to work back to probably £1,500 per square metre affordable subsidy. Whereas for the CIL, you're only looking in this particular case at something around 300. So it's a factor of 5 or 6 fold is the impact of affordable housing relative to the CIL that's being required. So giving a small amount of affordable housing away in the negotiation will deliver large amounts of CIL.
Okay, well, Mr. Jackson, you've still got a hand up. Do you want to come back on that?
Apologies, that's just me not putting my hand down. But
that's okay.
The point to make is clearly that any give on affordable housing for my client and is not going to really doesn't help them. But again, we've got to test it on a site-specific basis.
Okay. Still got a hand up, Mr. Devonshire.
Yeah, I mean, it was just simply the point that actually throughout the viability assessments for CIL, the affordable housing percentage has remained static at 35%, which is what we've tested, and therefore actually what we've done is we've basically varied the CIL around the affordable housing delivery static affordable housing delivery at 35%, which is why you get variable CIL in, say, like as we said, like the Virginia Water area, and then you look at somewhere like Staines Border and North, because it's not just the viability of that, but it's also the viability of the affordable housing target, which we have tested on a static basis at 35%, because that's what's in the local plan, and therefore the CIL varies around that.
Okay. Right. Well, I'm going to draw session 4 to a close at that point. I'll just see if there's any final comments before we move on. I think just taking stock of where we are, I think we'll probably take a short break now. When you look at the number of sessions, you might think that we've got a long way to go, but I think session 5 is going to be an interesting one. We're going to have a session on student accommodation, and we've got a couple of representatives who are going to be challenging the Council's assumptions and its proposals. I've read that at some length. It was quite an interesting set of submissions, so I think I understand it. And I'm going to, when we resume, I'm going to start that with just a brief resume of what I think I'm reading and what the issues are. But we'll have that session. I think the session on office development will probably be relatively brief. I don't think it'll be the full 30 minutes we've been allowed. All other development, session 7 will again be very brief, then a round-up session and then summing up. So I'm still confident we will close by probably by 4:30, 5 o'clock today. But if we just take a break now, if everyone's happy, we'll come back at 3:25. Okay, thank you.
One more session to go. Start in 10 minutes. Vic? Yeah, I thought you would. Hello. Oh God. Well, the fun. I think the fun begins now, to be quite honest. Yes, he is. I mean, luckily, yeah, there was a little bit where I know. I got to say, I was sat there at one bit, and I actually sent him a text, which I don't think he saw. Well, I sent him a text just to basically say, did you did you test the Schmal mix for the 1 hectare sites? If so, their points are relevant. Which is why I had to, yeah, which is why I had to butt in and just go, yeah, our 1 hectare sites were tested on a mix, policy compliant mix. I know he does. He does. Well, I'm hoping so. I mean, he sent. I don't know if you saw that note he sent through. Yeah, so I'm kind of hoping that. I mean, the problem is now, because I may have to defer to you and Rachel on this one in terms of what ground we could possibly concede on student accommodation if we can, because I don't know what I. Yeah. Yes, and it would have to be, because I was thinking about this, and it would have to be, we would have to take his recommendations to members, because the thing I was thinking that he might do, because he might look at basically Andrew's evidence, he might look at Strudge, Glowen, and oh, excuse me, Danehurst's evidence, and I was wondering whether he might basically ask us to go away and maybe collaborate together to come up with something. But I'm kind of thinking there's no point doing that if our members say no, we don't want you to, or that's great, what you've done, you know, what you've done collaboratively is great, but we're not supporting that rate. We want you to do 495. I think it's going to have to come from him, the examiner, in terms of, yeah, 495 is too much and it should reduce. Um, yeah, yeah, it does have to be, yeah. Yeah, I mean, unless it's a direction from him, our members aren't gonna jump, basically. So, I wonder if any of them are actually watching the YouTube cast. Well, when I'm looking at it, I actually I might not have told you about the bloody. Did I tell you about the technical glitch this morning? Well, I didn't actually realise until after we'd finished the morning session. I clicked back onto like the YouTube, and it was working fine. You could hear everybody, you could see everybody, until I came up to speak, and what you saw was a little picture of me, and then you couldn't hear me at all. So everything I've done in the morning session, you can't hear it. So I spoke, yeah, just me. So I checked with Rishi, and he basically went, "Oh, have you tried doing this? Have you looked at this?" And I went, "Yeah." And so he basically had to take control of my laptop, or the council's laptop, and say, "Oh yeah, it's because this thing here was on like a really low level by default." And I was like, "Well, it's not in your notes, so how am I supposed to know that?" well, session 3 and session 4, yeah. Yes, I mean there was a bit about garages. There was a bit about the infrastructure at Longcross. Was he? Not surprised, living in Virginia, Walton. Yeah. Okay, well, it might be coming our way in about 3 minutes. All right, bye.
Okay, welcome back. We're into then session 5. We're going to look at the proposals for CIL and student accommodation developments. I said I'd start this session just by taking stock of what I've read in the paperwork in terms of preparation. It's clearly quite a challenged area of the Council CIL proposals, and we've got speakers today on behalf of the university and also Danehurst. I must admit, I'm a little bit puzzled by some of the evidence, because when we were talking earlier in the day about the anticipated CIL revenue, it seems that the council's not actually anticipating any CIL from student housing development, or it's certainly not factored that into its calculation. When I read through the plan, it was clear to me that it's policy SL23 and the narrative that goes along with that the plan does recognise the importance of the university, and it also suggests that the growth in student numbers means that there is a need to provide more accommodation. And then just picking up the trail of the CIL evidence, the initial modelling that was contained within the final report was clearly the subject of challenges in terms of the assumptions made and the modelled viability. And I know that there is a revised appraisal that's been undertaken, which suggests a residual figure of £825 per square metre, but that again remains challenged. And I also picked up the fact that officers have recommended a lower CIL for student accommodation, but councils have rejected it. So, having taken stock of all that, I'm going to ask the council, I guess Mr. Golan, to explain what he's done, and Mr. Devonshire to explain the council's position. So, put me in the picture, and this is an opportunity for you and others that are going to speak to tell me what I should think. So over to you, Mr. Goland.
Oh, fine. Okay, sir. Yeah, I mean, the student housing is obviously one of several other than mainstream residential development that needs to be looked at. So that's what was done within the CIL 10, and the report. The section is in there in the relevant bit, page 66 to page 68. Then took on board, as a result of the recommendation, certain suggested changes, which were set out in my CIL 11 document, which is at page. One moment. That section, yeah, matter 2, section M21, review of representations. I looked at what had been said, recognising that there are different types of student housing coming forward in the local authority area. Taking on board what had been said about the potential coverage and the size. I looked at the issue of the costs. Some of the more general points, shortage of supply. I recognise a particular issue and arguably lead in principle to a kind of split target approach for the student housing. I don't necessarily agree it should be split. We can perhaps come to that. So I remodelled in my July representations paper with the revenue, the rent, development costs at 2750, which I think broadly were in line with the Stride Triglawn estimate of build costs. And I came up with, once the benchmark for the site was taken into account, came up with a benchmark of 825, which is obviously the starting point for a debate about viability. I've obviously had a look at the two papers that have come back as a result of the modifications, and I can perhaps say more about what my response to those would be. There's much of it, some of it I agree with, much of it I don't, but we can perhaps hear from the.
Well, perhaps I could just pause you at that point, because what I'm keen to understand, it maybe Mr. Devonshire comes in on this. If you use the analogy of some of the other development types we were talking about earlier, I've got a good feel for the number of houses coming forward in the plan period and where they're going to be. I've also got a good feel for employment floor space, where quantum and where that's going to be. I haven't got a feel from the plan or anything I've read for the likely amount of student housing development, other than I've read elements of the local plan, and it feels to me that there is a desire and a demand for more accommodation. So I don't know if that's probably more for Mr. Devonshire than Mr. Goland. So if he could come in on that.
Hello?
You there?
Yeah, you can hear me then. It's the delay again. Policy SC1 of our local plan, whilst it doesn't set out a target or a requirement for student bed spaces, there is a note in the table 3, which is the spatial distribution and growth over the period of the local plan. You'll see the total in that table at the bottom gives 3,513 student bed spaces. At this moment in time,
page 34. Yeah.
Yeah, since the or I suppose since the start date of the local plan, which is the 1st of April 2015, there have been 1,238 student bed spaces completed. From our monitoring, that would appear to be 621 of which are cluster and 617 self-contained studio apartments.
Sorry, can I get those numbers again? 621 cluster.
621, we believe 621 are cluster developments, and 617 self-contained studios.
Okay.
From our monitoring, it looks like we have a further 2,402 bed spaces permitted. 2,162 as cluster, 240 as studio apartment.
So I missed the first number. 2402.
2402 permitted.
Yeah.
2162 of those as cluster, 240 as studio.
Okay.
The 2162 as cluster might be slightly overestimated. I mean, it's the units that have been permitted through the master plan at Royal Holloway. So they may not all be cluster, but I believe that the vast majority are cluster. The completions and commitments at the moment total 3,640 bed spaces. I know from, obviously we heard from Stride Glown earlier about that in terms of Royal Holloway, some of that master plan might not be put into effect. In other words, those 2,162 units still to come forward at Royal Holloway may not materialise on that particular site, but obviously there is a undetermined application at the moment, which is at a site called Rusham Park, which is just to the southeast of the university campus. And at the moment there is a planning application in there for 1,400 bed spaces, with potential for a phase 2 of 600 bed spaces. So that would probably reduce the number of student bed spaces either as completions or commitments. I think it's by about 30 odd units from the 3,640 that we have through completions and permissions at the moment. And I think with the completions that we've had at the moment, 621 have been in the university campus. And of the 2,000 of the commitments, 2,029 were on campus, 373 off campus. But as I said, obviously that's part of the master plan for Royal Holloway, which obviously, as Stride Glower mentioned earlier, may no longer be coming forward. Aside from that, there are no, as far as we're aware, there are no further planning applications or pre-application discussions for student accommodation in the area.
So what I'm picking up from you then, Mr. Devonshire, is you're saying that in terms of the quantum of new student housing development envisaged in the plan, a big chunk of it's been built, and an even bigger chunk of it is permitted and committed.
Yes, notwithstanding Stride Glown's earlier comment of the potential for some of the cluster units on campus as part of the university master plan not coming forward, but potentially being replaced by the potential development at Rusham Park.
Okay, right. I'm going to. We've got a bit of feedback. I've got an indication from Mr. Renshaw, and Mr. Renshaw, would you like to come on the screen and speak to us?
I'm yes. I just wanted to confirm one or two points in terms of the numbers here. Firstly, the 1,238 completions that were mentioned, yes, 621 of them were by the university as part of this 2,650 that it has a permission for through an outline planning permission. The other 617 would not have been all units. They would have been a mixture, which I think Danehurst would probably be better able to explain, as I think two of those schemes were, in fact, Danehurst. But the key issue from the point of view of the university is that the potential to deliver those the remains of the 2,650 on its existing site is no longer there. One reason is that one of the sites, Royal Holloway University of London, is a constituent body of the University of London. And similar to Cambridge and the colleges, it is has that sort of relationship. The University of London has a site on the campus which we thought would become available for student accommodation development. That is not going to be available during the planned period. And secondly, as you'll have seen from our note, there has been a considerable issue in terms of developing student accommodation adjoining Englefield Green Village. And the university is looking to transfer a good number of units from there onto the Rusham Park side. So Rusham Park does not have planning permission, and therefore this is the reason for the university's representations on CIL.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Renshaw. That's really helpful. Got Mr. Stevens, do you want to speak?
Yes, thank you, sir. I just wanted to pick up on what Andrew's just been saying, just for clarification, really. When our original April 2020 submission was made, the outline planning application that had already been submitted in January was for 2,000 student study bedrooms. That figure has effectively now been revised to the 1,400 that Mr. Devonshire has already referred to. Therefore, the phase 2 600 beds would be the subject of a separate fresh planning application in due course, and that would likely to be determined, if submitted of course, after CIL is introduced. So at the moment the Rusham Park application for 1,400 units is scheduled to be determined by the end of this year, but that wouldn't include the phase 2 reference. So the university are trying to move forward with its accommodation plans to effectively catch up a little bit on where it had hoped to be when the original planning consent had been granted.
So phase 2 is an extra 600, is it?
Phase 2 is a future fresh planning application over and above the revised outline planning application that's currently in for determination.
I've got you. Okay. Right. Okay, that gives me a clearer picture in terms of numbers and locations. What I was saying in my try to introduce this item, I read the submissions that the model that Mr. Gunn carried out initially was criticised for being the wrong type of development, 5-storey, when it would be a different form of development, and many of the modelling assumptions were criticised. And then there is a revised model in the it's what is it in? Is it CIL 11, isn't it? I think. Is it CIL 11? Yes, it is. Really, I just wanted to sort of pick up from those, and I think I'll probably ask Mr. Golan just to pick up a bit of the detail around the latest model that he's produced, and I guess this is his response to the representations made. If it helps, Mr. Golan, we could ask Charlotte to get a relative the respective page up on the screen.
Yeah, I can just kind of go through the headline figures.
Please do.
Okay.
Sorry, which document do you want?
Sorry, let's.
CIL 11.
CIL 11, and if you go, we haven't got page numbers.
It's under
M2.3. That's it. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah. So, under the same general headings as for mainstream residential, revenue, costs, residual value, and benchmark, the rents that have been submitted by Danehurst, I believe, range between 225 to 240. I went slightly shy of that in my revised estimate. I ground for the university. Okay. Stride to ground for the university have suggested 165 for the rent per week, and I believe that's on the basis that they want to provide more affordable accommodation. And I think where the discussion is moving, not necessarily correctly, but it seems to me that there seems to be a case being made for potentially 2 levels of CIL. I don't think it's justified for the reason I'll come to. If you can just come down the page a little bit. To the blues. Keep going. That's okay, that's fine. So to the blue bit, which is the development costs, we had a bit of toing and froing, and I know that this figure here of 2750 is still shy of what Danehurst are putting in. I think they're closer to 3,000, but the figures from Stride to Glam for the university suggest something that's very close to that figure. Then the usual additions: professional fees, finance, marketing fees, margin, give us development costs, take development costs away from the capitalised rent to get to a positive residual value on a per square metre basis of 1092. I've then taken on board what I've been told about the potential coverage on a per hectare basis. It's almost 7,500. Working up to on the residual to a land value benchmark of 2,000, given them the surplus per square metre. I accept the arguments about the different levels of rent, but I would like to learn more precisely about the difference in terms of how these different types of units are procured. So I would think, I would think that the university would normally, when they're providing student accommodation directly, would be doing so effectively under a contract basis. And if that is the case, then the margin that is allowed here at 20% is, I would argue, to be too high. So although the rent would be lower for the university accommodation, it will be procured in a different way on a less speculative basis, which has some balancing effects on the lowering of the rent. And very happy to look at the intricacies of that, or the justifications for that, subject to people kind of feeding back on that.
Yeah, I'm just going to butt in there at that point. Just say that the difficulty for me as the examiner here is that it's not my role to sort of facilitate a discussion about what the CIL rate should be and what the right model is. I mean, I've got to form a view based on the evidence in front of me. And the evidence is staring on the screen. That's your evidence, and I've got counter evidence from others that I'll hear. So whilst I'll let it run a little bit and hear submissions from others, I think you've got to recognise that from we are in the examination now, and I need to form a view as to whether the evidence that you presented and the council's response to it in terms of the 495 proposed CIL are justified, or whether there would be a threat to viability at that level. That's the key question I'm wrestling with. So should we take let's take a couple of contributions from those sort of opposed or challenged views. Mr. Stevens, are you still? I've got a hand up for you. Are you happy to speak and just set out the view?
Yeah, of course, sir. So you would have received a statement from us on Friday, which attempted to summarise the issues that we wish to raise today in direct response to your agenda questions. The order of headings that you covered on the residential this morning was very interesting, and we've tried in the lunch break to effectively restructure our statement to correspond with some of the main headings in the viability model. There were a couple of points I wanted to raise sort of opening remarks before I then covered issues such as land value and the type of accommodation and construction costs, but I didn't know quite how you wished to break this session up, whether you want me to go through all of the issues in one go, which will probably take about 15 minutes, or we break it down into the individual sections.
I think do it in one go. I mean, this is your right.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, I'll try to be as brief as I can, but I'll also try to structure it in the same order. So if we go on that basis, I just wanted to start off by saying that the university doesn't build accommodation for its own financial gain, but it does so as part of a complex experiential offer to students, effectively to ensure that they can secure good value and good quality accommodation in an environment of pastoral support, along with a commensurate education. And the availability of good quality and good value accommodation, which was historically viewed by the university as a nice to have and the students, is now often a key deciding factor for students deciding on which university to attend, especially since the substantial increase in fees in recent years. So the evidence, the different evidence in respect to viability that's been submitted by the university and Danehurst developments is essentially to be expected, as the circumstances in which each operate are different. And Danehurst have also distinguished between cluster flat developments and studios in terms of residual value, and that's where I was going to go first. In terms of land value, as per the university's comments on page 8 of its August submission, the university contends that a 1 hectare redevelopment site, should one exist within the area around the university, this would have a value significantly in excess of the £2 million assumed by AGA. Indeed, redevelopment land outside the Greenbelt would be extremely attractive for residential development, where values would possibly be multiples of the base value presented by AGA. In relation to the earlier debate regarding residential values, and in particular the variance between theoretical and real life values, I think it's important to highlight that commercial land extending to 6.4 hectares, as Mr. Devonshire referred to, known as Russian Park, and is located within the Greenbelt, was acquired by the university in 2017. A recent 2020 evaluation of that site on, I believe, existing use value, estimated the value of the site to be circa 2.5 million per hectare, around 25% higher than the baseline commercial land figure presented in the AGA viability evidence. So I then wanted to move on to rental levels, and that this issue, much in the same way as residential in part, is to do with the type of accommodation, but also in university terms, the duration of any student tenancy. The university originally accepted that the AGA viability evidence underestimated the rental level per bedroom per week and the length of the rental period in any calendar year. In relation to the duration, that's set out in pages 4 and 5 of our August submission. However, AGA also underestimated the average size per student study bedroom, and this last assumption contributed towards an excessive capital value per square metre. University doesn't accept that the AGA, the university does accept that AGA changes in the stated yield from 4.5% to 5.5% does suppress the capital value. The review process undertaken by AGA following our April submissions resulted in a series of notable changes to the evidence. Despite the university presenting average rental levels of £165 per week within the original submission, the revised worked example presented by AGA increased, as we just heard, the rental level to £200 per week. We understand that this is effectively due to AGA using rental levels achieved by the specialist private sector student accommodation provider Danehurst and Englefield Green, notably the pad and the podium located off Egham Hill, and Mr. Golland has just effectively confirmed that. Those schemes, though, are generally based on 4 to 6 bed cluster flats and premium studio apartments. So it's important to note that in the university's evidence, their preferred type of accommodation for students are in 8 and 10 bed cluster flats, a very different accommodation and economic model to that provided by the private sector in the area. In the Council's response to Danehurst's evidence, the comment was made, I think it's on page 10, that, and I quote, the smaller sites are by definition more exclusive and hence are likely to achieve higher values. But the university contends that that's only the case if small sites generate a higher rental income as a result of larger and premium studio apartments and not cluster flats. AGA accepted that the average area per bedroom had originally been underestimated and increased this towards, but still below that which is the norm within the university accommodation. Page 5 of our original submission refers. With the headline rental level far in excess of that charged by the university, the capital value presented by AGA remains far higher than accepted by the university. So in relation to the type of accommodation, as previously been said, the student accommodation provided on campus by universities is generally provided in cluster flats, either in the form of modern blocks or townhouses. Off campus, though, specialist private sector schemes tend to deliver units which include studio apartments, and these generate a higher rental level based on their size, quality, fit out and management. Schemes with a higher number of studio apartments are likely to result in a higher surplus per square metre, capable of meeting a contribution towards CIL. And in fact, this point is also accepted by Danehurst as a provider of accommodation in the area. At £165 per week rental and at an average of 27.5 metres per bedroom, there is a fundamental difference in the nature of the offer and the underlying viability between cluster flats provided by the university and premium studio apartments provided off-site by the private sector. So as such, the university has demonstrated it's not viable to charge CIL for on-site cluster flats. Given the different economic model, separate consideration should therefore be given to the degree to which off-campus, private sector-led purpose-built student accommodation could make a contribution to CIL. The NPPG refers to this as set out in page 4 of our original submission. It's also important to bear in mind that in relation to the duration of the student tenancy, that's been provided by the university as 44.8 weeks average and not 48 weeks as provided by AGA. The important thing to bear in mind is that not all student accommodation will be available or appropriate for summer schools and conferences when the students who are resident of the various semesters are in occupation. Those sort of extra income over and above the undergraduate or postgraduate student tenancies need to be very close to catering and lecture theatres, etc. So the latest accommodation that has been provided at George Eliot Hall, which is primarily cluster flats, isn't generally used for conferences, despite the fact that they do tend to demand a higher rental value per week. Now, there was one point, sir, I wanted to raise that I think you're aware of through our statement that we didn't include within the original evidence, but there is a precedent example which I would like to refer to if possible, which I think would be helpful to everybody to understand how others have dealt with student accommodation elsewhere in the country. The approach I've just described that effectively treats student cluster flats differently from studio apartments has parallels with the way in which Leicester City Council considered the way in which CIL should apply to student accommodation. In that case, the local plan position in Leicester was similar to that set out in the adopted Runnymede local plan, insofar as there was a positive policy which was in place which encouraged student accommodation. Proposals in that case would normally be accepted if they met identified needs, were well designed and managed, could be well integrated with the local built form and existing communities within walking distance of the main campuses. So in broad terms, quite similar to aspects of policy SL 23 of the Runnymede local plan. The issue was considered in 2015 in Leicester, and while the financial context obviously was a little different, the evidence supplied and the examination debate resulted in both revised and further revised appraisals of student accommodation developments, where an assessment of cluster flats and studio accommodation was undertaken. In the Leicester case, the assessments were retested at 60 beds, 175 beds and 500 beds. The council accepted that the revised evidence warranted a reduction in the draft CIL rate from original proposal of £100 per square metre to £30 per square metre. However, the examiner found that there were outstanding concerns about the assumptions made for a number of key inputs into the model. The examiner in the Leicester case therefore acknowledged the fact that even if student accommodation was currently viable, it does not, of course, mean that it would continue to be viable if CIL were introduced. While the PPG did and does not prescribe a single approach to assessing viability, it does require robust evidence and a realistic understanding of the market. The conclusion made in Leicester was that the proposed rate of £100 per square metre, as reduced to £30 per square metre during the examination for all forms of student accommodation development, was not consistent with the council's own evidence, as it would make it less likely that cluster student accommodation development, which were likely to be required, would take place. A modification ultimately reduced the CIL rate for all student accommodation to zero. In relation to Runnymede, the separate consideration of cluster flats and studio apartments is not only called for by the university, but also appears to be supported by Danehurst Limited. In terms of construction costs, the original viability evidence significantly underestimated the construction cost per square metre of student accommodation, as acknowledged by Mr. Golland, resulting in a residual value way in excess of what the university considers was realistic. Page 5 and 6 of our original April representation refers. The council also presented an artificially high density of student accommodation floor area per hectare, combined with an extremely low land baseline value for redevelopment opportunities in the area. The evidence presented an unrealistic viability case which overestimated the capital value of proposed student accommodation and arrived at a surplus of £2,000 per square metre. By way of contrast, using empirical evidence, the university presented the case that a more appropriate residual value was around £350 per square metre and that the surplus was around £100 per square metre. Notwithstanding the wider points made in the initial representation in relation to services provided or subsidised by the university and which reduced the pressure on externally funded social infrastructure, the case was made that for student accommodation of the type provided by the university to be viable, cluster flats could only attract a CIL charge of circa £25 per square metre. This compares with the 495 put forward by the council. Bear with me, sorry. In relation to the revised construction costs for purpose-built accommodation, we accept, obviously, that the AGA rate is little different to the university's own evidence. Given the higher capital value presented by AGA, their residual value is now 1,100 square metres. The university's updated evidence, which accepted a reduction in the average room size from 30 to 27.5, results in development costs being higher than the capital value. As set out in our revised evidence, our calculations result in a negative residual value of £227 per square metre. I think it's also important to bear in mind, in the context of the residential development earlier today, that the current model doesn't include any Section 106 or other related costs. So by way of context, the outline planning permission secured by the university for its master plan, its estate plan, required a payment of £100,000 towards sustainable transport measures, plus effectively contributions in kind as a result of SANG and SAM payments and physical works on site. In relation to the Russian Park proposal, and I realise that's not an allocation in the local plan, but it is hoped to deliver student accommodation in future. We have to bear in mind that the package of sustainable works that are being proposed as part of that scheme, including a new bus service, a new link road, level crossing and a pedestrian bridge, makes that £100,000 original contribution made in 2015 effectively a drop in the ocean. In relation to other, therefore, sustainability-related construction costs, I think it's important to highlight that traditionally the balance between development costs and income has generated a surplus for universities, which is then reinvested back into its estate. And as student fees have increased, so has the expectation of the quality of the accommodation now demanded and being offered. This is driving up construction costs, along with an increased sustainability credentials and costs that university are now expected to bear as a corporate social responsibility institution. Evidence is provided at the bottom of page 5 of our April representation in this regard. By way of an update, schemes we are now engaged with elsewhere, which are Passive House and targeting low carbon, are incurring costs around £3,000 per square metre, pretty similar, or certainly approaching the figures referenced by Danehurst. At the time of our April submission, these were anticipated to be in the order of £2,800. So that's all I have to say in relation to those points, and I've got some conclusions of the results following the model that I'd like to give later on, if that's possible.
That's fine. Okay. Seeing if anybody wants to. Well, I suppose let's back that over to the councillor, Mr. Goland, to respond. You've heard the case made by the university. I've got on another screen in front of me the alternative appraisal that they run, where they say the residual value is negative. So how would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yeah, that's a very helpful summary. Yeah, trying to stick to the same kind of headline issues. It seems Mr. Stevens said at the beginning that there were sites around that 2.5 million per hectare. I'm not clear whether that went for student housing or whether that went for something else, but it would appear on that basis that my analysis is not too far away. He is right that sites go for more than benchmark figures, as we read this morning. But that's a difference in land value and land value benchmark. So we're trying here to strike a balance between getting the necessary infrastructure and kind of fighting the land market in which people often pay overly for sites. But it would seem to me on that there's a relatively good degree of common ground on the benchmark for the site itself. Yeah, taking board all the points about the differences in accommodation. That may lead to a split SIL. I don't necessarily would necessarily go along that line. I think one of the key issues here is, okay, for student procured accommodation, it is being done, as Mr. Stevens said, with an idea of getting high quality accommodation at relatively affordable rents. What I'd like to explore is who's actually providing these units, if they're going to be built, won't necessarily be built on a speculative basis. I would guess they'll be built on a contract basis. In my the point I was making, in my appraisal, I have a 20% profit margin in for all types of student accommodation. And I wonder whether that actually is appropriate. Because if you were a university, one would imagine that you could get a contractor to build your accommodation at a significantly lower profit margin. And on that basis, okay, it doesn't look good at the 20%, certainly on the basis of their figures. But actually, if you factor in a lower profit margin, which I think is quite justifiable, if you want to split the routes, if you like, the student accommodation, you then get more parity with the privately developed stuff, which arguably should be at a higher profit margin. So I think that's one of the key issues around the numbers. The Leicester example is interesting because I'm looking out my window now at a student accommodation here in Leicester. I'm not privy to the machinations of what happened with Leicester City Council, but I think possibly at the time of 2015, which was kind of pre-King Richard III and pre-Jamie Vardy, we were trying to desperately get the city going. We were trying to desperately get it going with student housing as a kind of lever to regeneration. So I just wonder in that case whether the SIL was kind of reduced on the basis of wanting to get that type of development going. So I wonder whether Leicester actually ultimately is as good an example as you're suggesting. Of course, they didn't go ahead with the SIL at all, and then for the Leicestershire authorities went ahead with the accommodation. But yeah, we're not. This is not. Leicester is not Runnymede. The development environment is much more difficult and much less viable. So one would expect a significantly lower margin to be a lower SIL, if there is one, to be kind of coming out of that situation. On Mr. Stevens' appraisal, I'm intrigued that it's coming out as a negative figure. Without interrogating it further, it appears that in going from the April 2020 appraisal to the August 2020 appraisal, that the viability has got significantly worse, and we now appear in a situation in which there is a negative residual. So before you take the land value benchmark into account, the situation doesn't stack up. So I wonder, on that basis, whether that puts the kibosh on student housing from their perspective, irrespective of whether there is a SIL or whether there is not. There's one further point, and I'm just scratching through my notes to find it. I think there was something where it stated that a SIL of £120 would be appropriate for the sector as a whole, but I don't know whether I need to identify that exactly and perhaps revert to that at my next opportunity. Thanks, sir.
Okay. Mr. Stevens, want to come back on any of that?
Yes, sir, thank you. There's a couple of points there, really. The first point, in terms of Mr. Gollan's suggestion that suddenly we're facing a situation where we're in a massive negative, I think that just goes to show, sir, your earlier point at the start of the day, that the outputs are effectively generated by the inputs. There have been other changes made in the council's evidence between April and August that make a material different to the conclusions. So, for example, there are many things: the rental levels, the duration, the yield, the development costs all affect the viability. The point being that we're simply highlighting that by what seems to happen is that the AGA have conflated aspects of our own evidence from the university and aspects of Danehurst's evidence applied a different yield, which generates a fundamentally different capital value. We're pretty close, actually, in relation to development costs. The wider point I was going to make is that the university obviously has a range of different options to procure student accommodation, and it effectively tries to balance all of the financial aspects of its accommodation to enable a reasonable surplus or yield to be created to offset the recurrent costs of running and operating the accommodation. So increasingly, universities are effectively extracting monies out of student accommodation, not so much because of the excessive yield, but as a consequence of managing and constraining its maintenance costs, which obviously have a long-term consequence of creating backlog maintenance within their estate. So they've got to balance a whole range of different things, including the experiential offer that they're providing to students. It's important universities compete in a very competitive market. They've got to make sure that they can provide good quality accommodation and match that accommodation with its educational offer. I'll come later on to the issues of the fact that the university already provides significant social and other infrastructure, which isn't taken into account at all in the viability model, but obviously is important because not all students are likely to need the social infrastructure that is incorporated within CIL as per our original submission.
Yeah, I read your submissions on that. Okay, I just wanted to ask Mr. Brackland from the representing Danehurst, if you're there, would you like to contribute on this, please?
Yes, I would. Thank you very much for letting us do that. May I first say that I'm not a planning consultant. I have only gone through the planning process, and I speak entirely as a layman, so I doubt I shall be as eloquent as Mr. Stevens. But in going through the fundamental points that we can see from the documentation provided by the council, I think I shall comment mainly on the modifications in July. And our fundamental issue remains around the land value and the evidence to support that you can acquire a site suitable for student housing in the vicinity of the university at the £2 million mark that has been suggested. We take issue with the use of purchase values incurred by us for acquiring the pad and the garage, in that they are incomplete and have been used to support the £2 million land value. But if the full picture is actually considered, then the land value, as far as we can see, is closer to 6 million per hectare, based on the pad and the existing use valuation we had done in 2010, I think it was, or 2009. Then we have, in terms of the critical assumptions that has been applied, we welcome the fact that there has been adjustments following feedback given by the university and us. We still challenge the square meter ratio per bed provided. We do not think 25 is correct. We think 30 is much closer to what's actually being built in the area. So this is local evidence. And I think with COVID, the requirement for room sizes to remain as they are will probably be stronger. And therefore, I do not think that we will see student housing in Egham coming close to the 25 square meters per bed as proposed. Secondly, we have a 20% OPEX cost, maintenance and management assumed. The university are at 21.2, which I think is obviously is correct given the very large number of student units they manage on smaller sites, where you are talking about bed size units in the hundreds. Obviously, the costs are higher because the economies of scale are less. Then there is the build cost per unit, and the 2,750 that is referred to in the worked example seems to me to be based on the lettable space, i.e. that the 2,750 multiplied by the lettable space gets you to the construction cost. If you include the non-lettable space, then the build cost per square meter is around 2,060 per square meter, and that, in our view, is quite low. If I have understood the figures correctly, let me put that caveat in. We strongly believe that there is a difference in the value and the economics of a scheme that is studio-led compared to one that is cluster-led. The rent for a cluster bed is obviously considerably less than that of a studio. So the return per square meter built is considerably higher for a studio-led development compared to a cluster-based development. I think the demand in Egham is probably more for cluster. Certainly the university expressed in the past a preference for cluster-based accommodation. From a social point of view, i.e. they want their students to socialize and get to know one another, but also it has a lower price point. The amount you have to build, however, is the same. So you have a lower lettable space ratio to what you have actually built compared to a studio scheme. I think that, to conclude at the high level, I think that there is growth to be expected within the university, and the demand for further student housing will remain. And I think with a CIL rate of 495, for which we believe there is no local evidence to support, there will be no further private student accommodation schemes coming forward in the vicinity of the university, with the logical outcome that the pressure on the local housing stock will only get worse compared to where we are today. And it is, as far as I understand, a stated policy objective of the council to release the pressure on the local housing stock, and this will go contrary to it, in our view. I think that concludes roughly what we think. I hope that was helpful.
It certainly was, and it does make me think of my earlier remark in the day when I said it's not my job to get you all to agree, but I'll, it's fine having the different views. I've got to weigh up the different submissions and form my own view on that. But I'm going to give the council an opportunity just to pick up anything they would like to by way of response, and then I'll go for some final comments, and we'll draw things to a close. So, Mr. Goland or Mr. Devonshire, would you like to speak?
Shall I go just on the kind of technical issues? I think I understand that there are nuances here in terms of the sizes of the rooms that you model. That will change things about, as you were saying, the inputs affect the outputs. Yes, you can have a further discussion around net and gross and so on, usable space, which may affect the build costs somewhat. One of the key issues remains the site benchmark. What I think the council is being asked to accept here from Danehurst is our existing use values from sites which are in residential use. But clearly the sites that have been brought forward, I think, have had large areas of gardens or large areas of space. And in the case of the garage, I think, had also some sort of local community land. And I think we're being asked as the council to accept an argument that the value of the house itself on a modest plot is being extrapolated across the whole site. So their submission talks about percentages of the site, then they extrapolate up. I don't think it's 6 million. I think it's more close to, I think we were being asked to accept something like about 40 million a hectare. I'm prepared to give you the figures that supports that. So I don't think that this benchmark is something sustainable. I'm much closer to the university on this, saying that our benchmark should still remain at about 2 million per hectare. Yes, except that the rents will be different, whether it's better. The question is then whether if the council wants to have a CIL for student housing, whether it then makes that split, and if it does, I accept the need for further evidence and further work on working that out. But clearly, there are limits to which the extent that CIL can become complex and related to specific routes of procurement. I still, in looking at the numbers, I still question, having got this far with the draft appraisals, I still question whether a 20% return for accommodation which has almost a kind of captive audience is appropriate, and particularly in the case of the university, who I think will be doing it on a contract basis to a contractor at a much lower rate, and that completely changes the economics of it. So on that basis, I would stick with the CIL that's been set out. Thank you, sir.
Okay, a few more indicated to speak. I'm going to go to Mr. Renshaw.
Sorry, sir, just having a bit of difficulty with the.
No problem. We can hear you.
Yes, this more earlier when we were talking, discussing the residual values and housing, there was talk about buffers and how if the rate for CIL was wrong, there was some margin in terms of affordable housing not necessarily being provided at the 35% rate. Student accommodation doesn't require affordable housing, so there is no buffer, and so it's absolutely important that any rate set should be the right rate.
Okay, understood that comment. I've got Mr. Bratland again.
Yes, if I could just comment on the £2 million land value. We illustrated in our letter in August that there are many ways in which you can probably calculate a land value. AGA have in their response used two of our sites as evidence, as facts, in support of the £2 million land value for a hectare site in this area for student housing. But the evidence they have quoted is incorrect. If the correct facts are used, the conclusion surely will be different.
Okay, Mr. Goland. No, you're on mute, sir. I think you're on mute.
Fine, sorry. First of all, to Mr. Renshaw, I don't necessarily think that point that issue supports your point, is it? Because surely student housing therefore has, if you like, a kind of unfair advantage if it's not providing affordable housing. So it's competing in the market, as I think you were saying earlier, that with other kind of general flatted development, for example, they're having to provide affordable housing and you're not. So therefore, the potential to deliver Section 106 and CIL is surely greater. The other response to Mr. Bratland on the land value, I'm not denying that land for student housing will sell for more than £2 million a hectare. It will sell for more than that. The issue, what we're concerned with here, is we're saying if you're developing those sites from residential properties, knocking down residential properties, then the starting point for looking at the CIL should be the value of those residential properties in the market without the benefit of a change of use. And like we were doing this morning, we're saying, is there a case for the council to take a contribution here in the form of a CIL or in the form of other Section 106, without stopping that development coming forward. So we're not denying it's going to sell for more in the market. We're just saying, where should the CIL cut in? Can the CIL cut in, given that you're buying houses and gardens which have a very low value, even compared to student housing and the residual that you're going to get?
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to try and draw this to a close, but I'm going to just ask the three main participants here to tell me what they would like me to recommend with regard to the student accommodation CIL. I think Mr. Goland, you were clear. You said stick with it as proposed.
I would say stick with it, but I would say with the rider that we potentially look more at the impact of the different rents in the different sectors.
Okay.
I think it's fair.
Okay, and I'm going to go to Mr. Stevens next.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to reiterate my earlier point that I haven't quite finished in terms of the main response to the viability assessments yet. So if it's okay, I'd just like to give three particular issues, one about social infrastructure, one about local plan and committed developments, and one about an overall conclusions of the results before then closing statements in session 9. Would that be okay?
Okay.
I just wanted to say that in relation to social and other infrastructure provided by the university, our representations obviously go in a lot more detail than we've been able to present here. AGA, for example, has not considered Section 106 and other infrastructure enhancements or provisions under its development cost assessment or the tangible benefits generated by the university through its provision of social infrastructure, green and play space within its campus. Pages 10 to 13 of our April representation refers. The other point I was going to make is that in relation to an earlier comment by Mr. Golland, I think it was about residential providing the vast majority of future CIL. There's a particular section on page 13 of our April submission that I think is relevant. I'd just like to read that one paragraph out. Assuming that 600 unit phase 2 of Rusham Park scheme were to come forward in the period 2025-26 to 2029-2030, this would incur a CIL charge of circa 5.777 million, which would equate to 27% of the total borough-wide funding gap in that local plan phase of 21.371 million. This assumes that phase 2 comprises only student accommodation and is based on a cleared site. The point I'd like to make, sir, is that through the council's own evidence, despite the fact that it doesn't propose any further student accommodation, the university could find itself in a position where, all of the things being equal and subject to a viable scheme, in fact, one phase of one student development within the borough could effectively be paying more than a quarter of the total funding gap in that local plan period, which we think is rather unfair. In relation to points made by Mr. Brackland and Danehurst, the impact on the local housing market, applying the CIL rate as drafted, I agree with him, will likely result in a dramatic increase in the use of houses of multiple student occupation in the Englefield, Green and Egham areas, and that this has the potential to change the underlying local housing market and character of these areas. Again, in this regard, the conclusions of her decision letter of the 5th of August 2019 in respect of Danehurst Development Limited's appeal at Harvest Road, the inspector noted that, and I quote, the need for student housing has placed pressure on the local housing market. The proposal would also support the university's growth and development with convenient access to the university campus, and that this weighs heavily in support of granting planning permission. Again, just a useful point, I think, relevant to a scheme immediately within the area. My final point in relation to local plan and committed developments, there are references in the local plan, as I said, to there being no expectation of further student accommodation coming forward, and that current commitments will meet the demand. When Andrew Renshaw has actually highlighted that we don't think that's relevant. I won't go into too much detail about that, other than to say that the book depository site's no longer available. But there's also been historic and vocal opposition within the local community for new intensive student accommodation proposals within the campus, within the settlement of Englefield Green. And combined, these issues have led to a need for the university to amend its accommodation strategy, and it will continue to necessitate fresh planning applications, which could be captured by CIL. The university has not been able to deliver student accommodation at the rates set out in the outline permission, and this is slowly increasing the take-up of private sector student accommodation and the transition of family homes to houses of multiple student occupation. And where over 800 houses are estimated to already be in shared use by students. So the university has demonstrated that if CIL is imposed, this will make student accommodation development by the university unviable. The threat of CIL and any unreasonable charge generated by CIL has the real possibility of preventing additional purpose-built student accommodation coming forward. This would result in the undermining of the local plan objectives, which seek to limit the pressure on existing housing stock, as set out in paragraph 6.61 and 6.63 and policy SL 23 of the recently adopted local plan. So in terms of the conclusions of the viability results, in terms of development costs, the gap between the AGA estimate and the university's estimate has reduced from £923 to £357. Following the changes made by AGA in their evidence, the resultant estimated surplus for accommodation is presented at £825 per square metre. And as we've heard, after due consideration of the updated evidence, council officers did recommend that the CIL charging schedule for student accommodation be reduced from £495 to £345. And the recommendations were made at the Planning Committee on the 15th of July, which overturned the recommendation and retained the original £495 charging rate. So whereas the original worked example prepared by AGA was based on a CIL charge of 25% of the estimated surplus, £495, the decision by the council to retain this figure results in the CIL charge now increasing to 60% of the estimated surplus. And whilst we disagree with that figure, we don't consider that that's consistent, and we think it's onerous. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Just see who I've got next. I think Mr. Bratland.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the finally the £2 million. I have seen no evidence in support of where that number comes from, and I thought that this was going to be based on local evidence-based approach. You asked what CIL rates should be applied. In setting any CIL rates, I don't think the council has justified the 495 in any way, shape or form. It is clear that it should be much, much lower. It is also clear that there must be a distinction between cluster-based and studio-based student accommodation.
Okay. I've got some more indicating. Mr. Stevens, you've still got a hand up. You wanted to come back in?
Yes, sir, very briefly. It was just a clarification, really. I just wanted to be absolutely clear that the figure that I referred to, which is the current existing use value at £2.5 million, is Rusham Park. It is occupied site, yeah.
Okay. Mr. Bratton, you've still got a hand up. Not now. Right. Okay. I think we'll draw a line there because I've heard the different views. Unless anyone wants to make any very final comments, I think we can move on. Okay, thank you. Right. Time is marching on, but I'm confident we can get there at a reasonable hour. We might just stray beyond 5 o'clock. I think what I'd like to do is merge items session 6 and session 7, because we'll be turning the pages on the same document. And I think, Mr. Gulland, if we could go back to your final report, and we will go to page 48. And well, in fact, let's go to the office part of that, which is on page 55. Then we'll go back to the beginning and turn the pages on the other commercial uses that you've tested. Now, if we talk then about office development, I asked some questions at the beginning of the day as to where it would be. I think as well we need to recognise we've got new use classes now, haven't we? Which B1A is now, is it E/EG1 or something? I need to look it up, but that's just a point I would need to pick up in my report for just a minor update. So, just Mr. Gulland, just talk me through what you've modelled for B1. Let's stick with B1 for now. We all understand that. B1 business use, and run me through it. You on mute again? I think you're still on mute.
Is that better?
That's better. Can hear you now. So yeah, I was just asking you to talk me through the office appraisal.
Yeah. I've used. I mean, it's the same methodology as if you're valid at the end. I've used a lot of parables and the best evidence on yields. Rent 50 per square metre, yield at 5%. Years purchase at 20 gives us a capital value of 500. Again, I've used BCIS costs. I'm assuming 2,000. Some may be more than that, some may be less. I think 2,000 is a reasonable marker according to BCIS. Adjusted it for the sorry factor. Then the other stuff, the other costs, fees, finance, marketing fees, margin, 20% of GDV. Total development cost 3,831. Net residual 1,169. Assumed a 1 hectare site. With coverage at 40%, so 40% of the area is covered in buildings, and 60% is given over to parking. Maybe a bit generous to parking, but I think a reasonable assumption. Gives us a residual of 4.7 million, less the commercial land at 2 million, gives us a surplus of 267,760 with a surplus per square metre of 669, and that's really it.
Okay, yeah, I understood the mechanics of the appraisal and what came out the other end. I'm interested just to hear a little bit, and it may be from Mr. Devonshire about the local market. Is it a place where spec office schemes have been happening in recent years? I appreciate right now they're probably not, but is this a fairly active market? Are schemes getting off the ground? Are there planning applications coming in over the years for this type of development? So maybe send that one to Mr. Devonshire.
Okay, I'll do a very quickly in terms of where we are with completions commitments, and I think my colleague Rachel might she's got her hand up, so I suspect she may give you an insight into the market. Where we are since 1st of April 2015, which is basically the start date of the local plan, I mean, we've had a small net gain in office floor space in the borough, so we're looking at around 681 square metres. But that does differ on location. So in our strategic employment areas, as we have now designated them under our 2030 local plan, completions in those areas total some 20,371 net square meters. However, outside of the strategic employment areas, there has been a loss of 19,690 square meters. And I don't think it's probably much of a surprise that most of those losses have been the prior approvals from office to resi. Again, sites with permission, it seems to be something similar. So we've got around about 31,000 net square meters of office floor space permitted within our strategic employment areas, but a loss of around 20,000 square meters outside of the SEAs. So that's where we are with our completions commitments in terms of where we are in the office market in which bits of the borough. But I'll just hand over to Rachel just in terms of attractiveness of the market and the borough.
Hello. The recent information that we have is that although rates of take up are down on previous years since lockdown in March, there have been speculative schemes in the borough, and one of those was the first speculative scheme that came off after the last recession. So there have been recent developments along the causeway, in particular with the developments for VMware at Lotus Park and along the Glantee for Gartner and their expansion. Mm-hmm. So the market has been reasonably good. It has slightly been because of the COVID-19 situation.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because I can see on the face of it the model's showing pretty healthy surplus, and you're proposing a relatively modest CIL rate, which maybe it's not going to be critical in terms of whether a scheme goes ahead. But just that question about COVID, the future of the office market. I mean, aren't we a great example right now? We're doing this all virtually. There's this supposed mass growth in home working, and I suppose devil's advocate question, is this the right time to be imposing an additional burden on an employment generating land use, given those uncertainties?
Recent discussions have shown that, interesting, there seems to have been slight increase in interest in office space out of London, but on the periphery, within kind of business park locations and those locations where there are reasonably good parking ratios. And I think the parking ratios have been quite key in driving some of the redevelopments and refurbishments that we've seen. I think it's a little bit early to say what the longer term implications will be, but we're not showing a complete drop off in the market at the moment, and it was as I said a reasonably good market up until recently.
Thanks. Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks. Okay, well, Mr. Golland, if we could skip back a few pages, and I just want to really just breeze through the other testing that you did, and I'm looking on page 49. And turn the page on to 50 and 51. I mean, your modelling there for A1 retailing does show quite a healthy surplus, doesn't it?
Yeah, in the sense that you get A1 retail developed. Obviously, there's limitations on the space and opportunities, but where it's happening, obviously from the examples of the rents that are being generated, yes, offices 200-ish. retail rents 300-ish. So it's generating a good margin with costs significantly below that. We're looking at a situation where there is a healthy surplus, as I think would be expected in most locations, and many authorities obviously are setting a CIL for the retail, for the A1 uses.
Yeah, but Runnymede proposing not to put a CIL in for retail. Okay, well let's have a look at the others then. So,
okay, I was just going to make a point about the retail, if that's okay.
Please, yeah, please.
Yeah, just in relation to, I mean, obviously the viability assessment is showing, a reasonably healthy surplus. But then also, if you look at, I think it's page 51 of CIL 10. Obviously, we're looking at potential rates or rental values of £236 in Addlestone, and you're looking at Addlestone in line with Chertsey, £250 to £270 per square metre, and Egham somewhere around sort of 376, 538. Yeah. Obviously, what's been tested is a rent of £350 around a yield of 6.5. So I think what we've done is for Addlestone and Chertsey, obviously the rental values look lower than 350, and so we did some sensitivity testing around that. And we also did some sensitivity testing around what would happen if yields changed. And I think that's set out in CIL 08. So in the section starting at para 567, which is on page 36.
Yes, I got it.
Yeah, so that pretty much explains why we haven't applied a CIL rate to retail development, simply because, I mean, the town centres in Runnymede, Addlestone, Chertsey, Egham, I'd probably go along to say they're more your secondary, maybe even tertiary centres. And so basically, I think the yields and the rents are more likely to be slightly on the lower side, in which case we kind of took a more precautionary approach and set a zero rate.
Yeah, understood. Okay, we'll just turn the pages on the others. So professional services was negative 830485, was a long way negative. Probably is even more negative if you did it right now. B1 we've talked about. B2 again is negative.
Negative.
And B8 warehouses marginally positive, but not much. And then hotels generated a surplus. Residential institutions negative.
Yeah, just again on the hotels, I think we set out in CIL 08. I think we set out in a sort of, again, some sensitivity testing around room rentals, and basically again came to that precautionary approach of setting a zero rate. Again, in the current market, whether or not there's a desire for hotel development is another matter as well. So.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, and D1, D2 uses were negative, and we mentioned retirement housing earlier. Student housing we've done to death. Talked through that. Okay, that's all fine. Thank you. Right. So a very short session. Well, I hope it's a short session on any other CIL matters. There is a draft instalment policy if anybody wants to discuss it. Wait a moment, see if any indications. Nope. And just an opportunity here then to pose the question as to whether there are any other CIL-related matters that anybody wants to raise before we go into the final session, which will be summing this up and a close. I'll just give that a moment. Nope. Okay, that was quick. Okay, well, we'll move into the final session, which is the summings up and the close. I'll say a few words at the end, but it's an opportunity now for anybody that wishes to speak to sum up the case that they've made, and if you are a representative who's made submissions, it's that final opportunity to tell me what I should think and tell me what you think I should recommend in terms of any changes to the draft charging schedule. So I do this in the reverse order to how we did the openings. I will let the council have the final say. It's their proposal. So we'll go through the representatives first. I haven't got a particular order, so who would like to speak first? I'll wait for a hand to go up and I'll go to you. Mr. Bratland, you are first, so over to you.
I shall be very quick. If the 495 is imposed, there will be little, if any, private field student accommodation. The rate that a viable scheme can carry is in the double-digit region. That's all I have to say. I think it would be an error if the current proposal is implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very clear. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, sir. Just in summary, we regard the proposed CIL charges as too high due to the adoption of benchmark land values that are too low, with reference to commercial land uses for which no evidence is provided, and no evidence is provided in respect of the policy compliant transaction evidence as a cross-check to ensure that the proposed benchmark land values are appropriate, and that will be in line with planning practice guidance. We also have concerns over the lack of garage costs, which is an omission which does not reflect market expectations and reduces costs to unacceptable levels. And the omission of A320 costs, oops, just turn my other phone off, sorry. Sorry about that. The omission of A320 costs, which is set out in the Infrastructure Delivery and Prioritisation SPD, which the council equates, I understand, to £249 per square metre, as referenced earlier on today, is a significant concern. And it's clear that the A320 costs can't be accommodated when we compare the surpluses that are shown in the council's evidence with that particular additional cost. And it's really regarded as appropriate for CIL to be adjusted rather than the negotiation of the A320 costs to be left to site-specific negotiation. So really the conclusion is that revisions are required to the CIL charges and the evidence base that supports. And that's all from me, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. That's very clear. Okay, Mr. Bratland, you still got a hand up.
Apologies.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Tenkeli.
Yes, just to emphasise that we think it's critically important that the council stays on top of the changing delivery of infrastructure at Longcross in the form of early years and primary education, parking for station use, and provision of primary healthcare facilities. If they don't do that, huge infrastructure burdens will be transferred away from what will not be a garden village, which is self-sustainable. It's up to the council how they deal with that, but I urge them to bear in mind the possibility of adding on CIL charges to Longcross to effect that. I agree that it shouldn't really be a matter of individual negotiation with sites to meet the repayment of the HIFA loan. And I think that the council should be sensitive to ensuring that the highest rate of CIL possible is charged, because in many cases, and specifically in Virginia Water, we have village infrastructure, and if you want to service a lot of extra development, well, frankly, you've got to pay for the infrastructure to allow it to happen. Otherwise, you must accept all of the health and environmental issues that will follow.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tankoni. It's very helpful and clear. Mr. Jackson next.
Yes, thank you, sir. Really short from me, you'll be pleased to hear. Really, the feeling I have, based on the evidence and the discussions we've had today, that the CIL rates are too high. I expressed concerns early on in the day around benchmark land values being too low and that lack of transactional evidence to temper the values that have been used in the viability appraisal work. I think there probably are issues around the impact of Brexit upon material costs and labour when it comes to building, and equally the sort of the impacts of COVID I don't think are anywhere close to sort of feeding through the sort of the economic system and the potentials for recession, and lending issues which will have an impact upon the residential property and sales market particularly. The other thing I should raise is that throughout much of the discussion there has been often comment about deferral to site-specific viability testing at the application stage. The MPPF has made it clear that viability is to be dealt with at plan making stage, and that seems to me that if we're going to end up in a situation where, because of CIL rates being too high, there's going to be a lot of viability testing at the application stage, it doesn't seem appropriate to me. From my client's point of view as a registered provider, they want to maximise the amount of affordable homes they can provide within the borough, and the issue seems to be, or the suggestion is that from the council's point of view, that is something that should be sort of allowed to flex and can be challenged. That doesn't sit comfortably with them, and certainly with the Zone B CIL rate of £300 per square metre, I think that when it does come to testing the application, that there will be a necessity for site-specific viability on our Brock's End nursery site. So,
thank you, Mr. Jackson. It's all very clear. Okay, just looking down the list. Mr. Stevens.
Thank you, sir. Last statement from me. I'm sort of torn between time and the importance of getting the message across, but I'll try to be quick. In summary, the university wishes to deliver purpose-built student accommodation in appropriate locations across its estate and in a manner that meets the needs of students, enhances their experience while at university, and contributes to the success of a world-class centre of learning and research. It can only achieve this if these goals if the threat of onerous financial burdens relating to the provision of accommodation is lifted. The university considers that had AGA approached them during the collation of the original and revised evidence base, nuances which exist between often on-campus accommodation, university and private sector models, and cluster flats and studio apartments would have been better understood, and a different approach to draft CIL charging schedules could have been taken. Universities' representations clearly go into more details than are presented here. AGA hasn't, for example, considered the issues of Section 106 financial contributions and other infrastructure enhancements or provisions. Neither does it acknowledge the tangible benefits generated by a range of social infrastructure services and facilities and green and play space within the university campus. It's also important to acknowledge that the university's preferred type of managed accommodation for students is in the form of 8 and 10 bed cluster flats, very different accommodation and economic model to that provided by the 4 to 6 bed cluster flats and premium studio apartments provided by the private sector. It's also important to perhaps pick up on the fact that the university, as far as the university is concerned, there is no demand for student accommodation outside the immediate area. This is evidenced by the reduction in the demand for its Kingswood Hall accommodation, despite modest rental levels. This site is around a mile from the campus. Students effectively want to be on or immediately adjacent to the campus in the Englefield Green area, and therefore the application of a £495 CIL charge across the entire borough as a blanket rate doesn't seem to be sensible. While AGA revised its evidence following initial submissions, it has essentially conflated information presented by the university and Danehurst, arriving at a rental level, a rental duration, yield and baseline land value, which as far as the university is concerned is unrealistic. A combination of factors has resulted in an excessive surplus and CIL contribution, which on-campus, university-controlled cluster flat accommodation cannot bear. Off-campus, specialist private sector schemes tend to include premium studio apartments, and that these generate a higher rental level based on their size, quality, fit-out and management approach. Schemes with a high number of studio apartments are likely to result in a higher surplus than cluster flats and could be capable of contribution towards CIL. This point is accepted by Danehurst as a provider of such accommodation in the area. Applying the CIL rate as drafted will likely result in dramatic increase in houses of multiple student occupation in Englefield Green and the Egham areas, and that this has the potential to change the underlying local housing market and character areas in these locations. University considers that applying the draft CIL rate of £495 would undermine policy SL23 of the newly adopted local plan, preventing specialist housing in the form of purpose-built student accommodation being delivered. The proposed rate is not based upon appropriate evidence and conflates issues relevant to cluster flats and studio apartments. It's therefore neither reasonable nor realistic. In short, the council will not generate income from the application of a £495 CIL charge, as the underlying developments will not be realised. It will threaten, however, the delivery of further student purpose-built accommodation, which has an important role to play in the long-term success of the university. In terms of what the university would like to see change as a result of the evidence presented and debated today, separate consideration should be given to the degree to which both on-campus university-controlled cluster flats and off-campus private sector-led student accommodation is capable of contributing towards CIL. As drafted, a single blanket rate covering all forms of student accommodation could result in significant detrimental impact on the attractiveness of the university to new students and threaten the future success of an educational establishment with a global reputation as a centre of excellence and learning. Thank you.
Well, thank you, sir. Okay, I'll just one last scan to see if there's any more hands going up before handing over to the council. I'm not sure who's going to do this. Who's going to make the summing up on behalf of the council?
So I think we'll ask Dr. Gollan to sum up, especially from sessions 4 and 5. I think that'd be the most helpful if that's okay with you.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I kind of looking at the information that I've jotted down during the day. I've kind of got several ticks. One tick is we seem to have agreed house prices. We seem to have agreed build costs. We seem to have agreed affordable housing revenue. They're three kind of big ticket items when you're looking at the viability. So I think those are all on the good on the good side. We've also agreed margin, and we've also agreed to a large extent the fees. On the question, there's been a lot of discussion about the question of benchmark. I think it's recognised how difficult it is to set this benchmark, and we've had a lot of discussion around transactional evidence. I think we should be much more direct in the way that we're looking at this, whether the schemes are viable. In looking at looking in particular at the existing use value and the residual value that's generated by these schemes, including affordable housing, including Section 106 and the margin the developer gets. And when we're looking at multiples of 100 at the bottom to 300 on agricultural land, which is going to take up most of the development coming forward over the plan period, to be having discussions about transactional evidence seems to me to be really weird. So I think we need to focus in on that, the multiples. In many other fora like this, the discussion is about whether a 10-fold increase or a 20-fold increase is sufficient. So I think the next point really I'd like to make is about the buffers. Just to reiterate how many of them there are within the study. So just to go over that again. There's buffers for the land. There's buffers for the cost of economies of scale. There's buffers in the fact that a large proportion of the scheme won't be CIL chargeable because it's affordable housing, and also for the smaller sites that also won't attract affordable housing as well. So those sites are, all other things equal, much more viable than the large ones, but the council has chosen not to increase its CIL on those smaller sites. And then there is the council's own buffer. So there's a whole load of good evidence which is backed up by the buffers which I've just set out. On student housing, obviously we've had a long discussion about that sector, I think. But the sector is ultimately competing with mainstream housing much better, in the sense that sector is not actually attracting affordable housing contributions. And from the perspective of the university sector, institutional sector, I actually wonder, even having put a large margin in at 20%, I wonder whether that's being too generous to them. If you take that down to a contractor margin, the economics of it change entirely. And I suspect that's probably why there has been student housing provided in the past, even though it's been at lower rents. A couple of points about Brexit and COVID. We've basically done our best with that. I mean, we've tried to sensitivity tested, and the council's taken a position on that in line with the evidence that we've got on changes in prices and changes in costs. But clearly, we don't have a crystal ball. So I think that's really all I wanted to say in summing up, sir. Thanks.
Okay. Anything further from the council officers in terms of summing up?
I think what we would say, sir, is that you feel that you're in a position to support the council's structure and the rates out therein. However, if for any reason you aren't of the view that any adjustment to the rates is required, we would welcome any recommendations that you have in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. That was a long day, an interesting day, and I think I certainly would like to thank the council and Charlotte for making the technology work. It's been certainly a lot better than I expected. I thought it was going to be quite stilted running the virtual session, but it did feel like we had good contributions from everybody, and I hope everybody felt that they had an opportunity to contribute. I now need to sort of spend a bit of time reflecting on everything I've heard and the evidence that's being presented. I'm hoping to write up my report in the next 3 to 4 weeks, and in that time scale, what actually happens is at the end of that, I'll produce a report which is issued to the council, and it's called the fact check report, and that literally is what it's a draft which goes to the council for them to check any matters of fact. it's not an opportunity for them to influence the report beyond that, although I did once have a council that tried to do that, but that's another story. So after the fact check process, the report will ultimately be issued by the council, and it'll be circulated to all of you that have taken part, and indeed all of those that have made representations and didn't actually join us today. So yes, I think really just like to thank you all for your contributions, and enjoy the evening with the screen turned off. So thank you, everybody, and you can now press the red button in the top right hand corner. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.